This is from the water itself.
So that's just from leaving it parked here?
Yep, and the tide come in and yes.
Audrey Waller is showing us the rust on her car. She says it's what happens when you live between the bay and marshland. It's a public housing development in Atlantic City, Buzby Village, which she describes as an otherwise ideal location.
It's the prettiest place ever.
From the top of her steps, she gets a direct view of the bay and marsh. But the area is constantly flooding. Take a look at some of the pictures she shared with us. They show the water coming up to her first step and the flooded marsh and road blended into one river.
When the moon's out, it floods. If the sun's out, it floods.
People may be concerned about the risk to AC's casinos and boardwalk, which sit just feet away from the beach. But scientists warn the western side of the city is in more trouble.
The biggest flood risk actually comes from the bay, not the beach side.
Ben Strauss is the chief scientist at the nonprofit organization Climate Central. He and his team released a study on sea level rise. It shows that by 2050, every coastal state will have some affordable housing units at risk of flooding, all a result of climate change. New Jersey is predicted to be the most affected. Nearly 7,000 affordable homes in the Garden State will be exposed to coastal flooding by 2050.
New Jersey has some of the big hot spots, and not only in terms of the total number, but it represents a large percentage of affordable housing in places like Atlantic City.
The report warns particularly of Camden, Salem, Penns Grove, and Atlantic City. It says residents of those cities could have a tough time recovering from future flooding. Their average median incomes are about $28,000.
You don't have a lot of spare resources.
In AC, 52% of its affordable housing stock is predicted to be exposed to flooding by 2050. Atlantic City Housing Authority head Tom Hannon says climate change was not a consideration when the barrier island was built up.
It's the kind of thing that if anybody in the plans over the hundreds of years that these communities were built had any idea that this is how things could play out in the future, I doubt there would be the development that there is.
Michelle Meyer runs the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center at Texas A&M. Her team has studied how low-income communities are particularly vulnerable to disasters and coastal flooding. She says some of the local flood planning may already be too late, or maybe based on the most recent big storm instead of future events.
We're not ready. We're not having these, most communities are not having these discussions, and then many times we see communities that have their last worst disaster as their model.
Hannon says his agency began redevelopment planning 2 years ago.
Looking at our properties to see what properties need to be rehabilitated, what properties have passed their useful life.
The first consideration was flooding. Hannon says the authority looked at flood plans. They also analyzed the damage done by Superstorm Sandy in 2012.
During Superstorm Sandy, none of the apartments of the residents actually got damaged due to the flooding that happened in that area.
But with the sea levels continuing to rise, flood damage is expected to be worse in years to come. Public housing and most privately owned affordable housing is subsidized through the federal government. Justin Scheid is HUD's New Jersey field director.
Is it even worth rehabbing some of these properties, or do you at some point have to shift and start thinking about completely relocating some of these people?
Yeah, that's certainly up to the local authorities to have those conversations with the communities and come up with those plans.
But he warns that HUD funding is limited. Back at Buzby, Waller says she's learned to live with the flooding. She doesn't know if she wants to relocate.
I don't want to move too far away from my son.
For the investigators, I'm Claudia Vargas, NBC10 News. Count on it.